Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Julia Friedlander. I am the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Geoeconomics Program. It is my distinct pleasure today to welcome Mariana Mazzucato, Professor in the Economics of Innovation and Public Value at the University of College London, in conversation with distinguished economist and fellow at Harvard University, Megan Greene. Today, we'll be discussing the relationship between economic welfare and national security. So this is how do we create a durable economic recovery out of the COVID economic crisis that serves all of our citizens? And what is the role of the public sector in helping us get there? We're going to start with some remarks by Mariana and then switch over to a moderated conversation with Megan. If you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the now very familiar Zoom chat function and we'll get to you when we can. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mariana.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Julia, Megan, and the Atlantic Council for organizing this. I'm going to put on my timer so I don't talk too much. It's a real pleasure to speak to you, and I've been working a lot globally on the issues that are at stake here, and I'd love it if we can, share, I think, some of our understanding of, what works, what doesn't globally. I think it really is a global agenda to get more inclusive growth, sustainable growth, and especially one, and this is what I'm going to focus on, getting a very different form of public-private partnership along the way. I don't know how many of you have been following the kind of Davos World Economic Forum events over the last years, and there's lots of talk, for example, about bringing purpose back to the center of corporate governance, more of a stakeholder value approach, less than just a quarterly earnings shareholder value maximization approach. And my belief is that we will only actually create change when that notion of purpose and public purpose becomes systemic, that it's not just about corporate governance. It absolutely has to go to the center of how all the different value creators in the economy, in the public sector, the private sector, the third sector, and citizen organizations actually come together, how they work together, how they invest together, how they innovate together, how they take risks together. So that's sort of the headline point. And I wrote a book back in 2013 called The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths, that really, in some ways, it was a historical book, asking the question, where have big innovations come from? And surprise, surprise, the state was very important there. But the fact that we don't actually have the language to talk about that, the fact that we continue to think that at best policy is just about fixing market failures. So we actually have to wait for systems to fail before we design a policy initiative, I think is one of the core problems that we currently face. It'll be extremely hard to actually structure a green transition or to achieve any of the 17 sustainable development goals that since 2015 nations worldwide have signed up to if we just continue to fix and bandage up different types of failures, whether they be caused by negative externalities like pollution or positive externalities like the importance of clean water and basic research. The real question is, what is the role of policymaking? What's the role of the state? And how can we, again, formulate public-private partnerships in such a way that they are explicitly about co-creating and co-shaping markets towards a direction that we want, right? Do we want more inclusive growth? Do we want more sustainable growth? And less about market fixing. And to be honest, that really requires a new kind of theory. And that's why then I wrote another book in 2018 called The Value of Everything, Making and Taking in the Global Economy, where I went to the heart of what is our theory of value in the economy that actually underpins some of the problematic structures that we have. So one of the main points I made in the entrepreneurial state, which I think is very important today, is the kind of investor first resort role that the state has played historically in order to get us basically all the general purpose technologies we've had. These are big technological changes that have affected production, distribution, consumption, from mass production to the internet, aerospace, today a lot of the green technologies. And there again, plotting out the different types of public investments across the whole innovation chain, not just the classic market failure around basic research, that was required to get us the kind of Silicon Valley miracle, because it wasn't a miracle. It was very much a result of those public investments in basic research, applied research, patient long-term finance, not inpatient long-term finance, to the companies that were willing to innovate and to engage with mission-oriented projects, from going to the moon and back to more recent mission-oriented projects around green transition that we are all hoping actually happens globally. And by patient finance, I mean both, if we also look at global actors, the presence of, say, public banks, which definitely in Europe, where I'm standing right now, or actually I'm in the UK, we're out of Europe, I have to still get hang of that, but I'm Italian, so I still think we're all in Europe. In Europe, for example, the European Investment Bank has been very important in providing that patient finance. In Germany, the KfW, but in the United States, it's quite interesting. It wasn't really through public banks, but patient finance through programs like the Small Business Innovation Research Program that really has been helping small, medium enterprises scale up, right? Starting up is not enough. You need to scale up through the power of public procurement. So something like 2.5 to 3% of each department's budget has been set aside through the SBIR program to fuel bottom-up innovation by SMEs towards public ambitions. And even more downstream, beyond procurement, bold policies like suburbanization, which didn't just happen because people wanted to go live in the suburbs. That itself came out of a policy making, and that is what actually provided the demand pull for the mass production revolution to actually have its full deployment and diffusion across the whole economy. So really the question that I asked in the book is, what are the lessons from that? What is the lessons about a decentralized network of different types of public organizations across the whole innovation chain, not just in little gaps, that were absolutely important, and why it's a myth to think that you just need a lot of science and then bring in the venture capitalists and somehow it'll all lead to growth. In fact, the form of venture capital in the US historically has also been part of the problem. Of course, it is very important. We need venture capital, but when venture capital is too exit driven, for example, wanting to exit in 3 or 5 years through a buyout or an IPO, what we get is what happened to the biotech sector, which there was a lot of rushing of the science. So we ended up with lots of PLIPOs, productless IPOs. Anyway, so those lessons about investment are important. And this is why I was once asked to fly out to Seattle and talk to Bill Gates, because he had read my book and said, well, we need the same thing around green. And we definitely had the entrepreneurial state around IT and the whole computer revolution, but we're not really seeing that today around the green revolution. And he really admitted that both he and Steve Jobs had basically surfed a wave of public investments that he wasn't seeing as bold as should be globally around the green revolution. But even if we get those investments, and we need them, and this is why it's really important to have debates about innovation policy and reviving kind of R&D and innovation around big goals, the next question is, how do you govern that process actually so it's benefiting the public, given that it's publicly financed? And here, one of the problems really is that it's not enough just to pour in a lot of money and then hope for the best, that it's going to benefit citizens. What we need is to be very careful to also govern, both through regulation, but also in terms of how we actually design the tools on the ground to make sure that we're fostering, again, the kind of growth and the kind of economy we want. And the obvious example there is around health. And we are living through a health pandemic. So this is a very important lesson that, in the US, for example, the National Institutes of Health put into the system over $40 billion a year around health innovation. But then if we don't govern the system, it doesn't necessarily produce the results we want. So we need to be very careful, for example, with intellectual property rights, that they be designed in such a way that really fosters what William Baumol used to call productive and not unproductive entrepreneurship. So if patents along the way are too wide, they're too strong, wide, I mean, say, used for strategic reasons, too strong, hard to license, and too upstream, so that the tools for research, the tools for knowledge creation are actually getting patented and privatized, that hurts the kind of diffusion that you would ideally want when the patent is actually up after 20 years. And that kind of dysfunctionality has also then hurt the ability to have what the World Health Organization has recently called collective intelligence. And they've been arguing this around the vaccine. We want to race towards a vaccine, of course, but we need to govern that towards the objective that we want. If it's going to be universal and fully accessible, then we need to make sure that, for example, in that particular case with the vaccine, that we actually pool the patents. But one could argue also that beyond the vaccine in general, and you definitely see this across different medical areas, that the prices of the drugs should also be governed in such a way that we're not pretending it's the free market or value-based pricing, that should set the prices, but actually there should be a reflection of all the different risk takers that took part in that value creation process. So today, for example, we have a therapy for COVID-19 called remdesivir. It's being marketed by Gilead for over $3,000 a dosage, and it actually received $70.5 million by the U.S. taxpayer. And where did that investment, was that investment actually taken into account when Gilead set that price? And the answer is no. And this is not an exception. This is actually very much the rule, that the way we currently govern the price system within health isn't actually taking into account one of the key actors. And that is important, not just in terms of fairness, but also in terms of really getting an approach or designing an approach towards inclusive growth that is not just about redistribution, but also about pre-distribution. So getting the contracts right in the first place, getting the relationships right in the first place, getting the prices right in the first place that are actually really do reflect that stakeholder value and collective value creation process is, I think, a very, very important point. One thing that I've been working on in Europe, just in that heading there of trying to also govern innovation in the public interest, is really, again, also inspired by what I think worked really well in the US some years ago, half a century ago, which is this kind of strong push for innovation to be problem focused. Right? We didn't get the internet because organizations like DARPA were worried about the internet. They were solving problems. They were solving, in the case of the internet, the problem of getting the satellites to communicate. GPS as well, funded basically by the US Navy, also was solving a problem, and GPS was the result of that. The whole software sector, you could say, was emergent, was a spillover of solving the problem of getting to the moon and back again in one generation, something that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of this year. So, the question that we have today, besides governing the innovation process also in the public interest, like governing patents to make sure they're not abused, is also how can we really be bold with the way we're framing modern problems, again, around the green transition, around health pandemics, around inequality, that can then stimulate bottom-up innovation, investment, across all sorts of different actors in the private sector and the third sector. And for this, what I've been working on in Europe, and this actually became law, so it's quite exciting, and I'd be happy to share more in the Q&A, this approach to innovation and industrial strategy, which is less about a list of sectors or technologies that we're going after, like AI, quantum computing, driverless cars, or the life science industries, and more about really setting global and national, regional, city level objectives that are mission oriented. And how a mission-oriented policy works is you begin with the challenges, which I often say, don't forget we have those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, but they might be interpreted in different ways in different contexts. Turn those into really concrete missions, targets that you can actually say, yes or no, did you achieve it? Yes or no, did we get to the moon and back again in a generation? Yes. But if you have climate change, say, as one of the challenges, a target can be, say, having 100 carbon neutral cities across a region, a nation, et cetera. And then the key point here is that, similar to what got us to the moon, these kind of mission-oriented policies need to really galvanize and catalyze as many cross-sectoral types of investments and collaborations as possible. Going to the moon was not just aeronautics, it was also nutrition, textiles, electronics, materials. And then bottom-up innovations within the private sector were really, really important. It wasn't just NASA. There was Honeywell, General Electric, Motorola. And these bottom-up projects came by designing policies like procurement, right, government as purchaser, in such a way that was really clear on what the objective was, but how you did it was up to you. Otherwise, that would stifle innovation if it was too top-down. And I think, again, there's lots of really interesting ways that that can be applied at the city level, at the regional level. But the first thing you also need is to get citizens in the democratic process in different types of forums, like citizen assemblies, to really engage at whatever level we're talking about, with really setting what are those problems that we should be going after. This shouldn't be seen as sort of a top-down process where, the experts, the academics, businesses, and governments get in a room and decide and tell us all what the big problems are. And in fact, the SDGs themselves did come out of a huge amount of stakeholder engagement globally. But just coming back to this notion of stakeholder capitalism, I think one thing that I've found very interesting globally right now, just in terms of these huge amounts, right, of public money going into the system, over 2 trillion in the US, over 2 trillion euros here in Europe, of which 800 billion is a specific pot called EU Next Gen, but the total is more than that, is the differences between how countries have reacted in terms of structuring those recovery funds to really build back better. So in France, President Macron was very clear. He said, these recovery funds are not just going to go and save business, they have to transform it. But not transform it, again, top down, kind of, with a stick, but really through this idea that what we're trying to do is to build back better. So he was very clear with the automobile sector and the airlines that the only way they would access the recovery funds was if they committed to reducing their carbon emissions. Or in Denmark, same thing happened, both around Greene, but also around the use of tax havens. You want to use tax havens? No problem, but well, it is a problem. Anyway, if you are using them, you're not going to be able to access the recovery funds. And actually in the US, the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, also has included within it prohibition of using the funds for share buybacks, right? This isn't rocket science. If you're getting money that is very needed in such a tragic time, use it to really reinvest back into production and ideally into the kind of production systems that will get us to really, and not just talk about it, building back better. But I do think that in the US, actually, some of those conversations haven't been as strong. My 15 minutes are up, so I'll stop here. But just to say that, how we actually structure recoveries matter. We had the financial crisis back in 2007 and 8. There was no lack of public money going into the system, but most of that money ended up back in the financial sector. So we can't afford to do it this time. At the very least, we have to make sure that we are strengthening our health systems. These are global health systems. Had this epidemic begun in a country that had weaker health systems than China, we would all globally be worse off. So strengthening global health systems is very important, but also really thinking creatively in a win-win kind of way, how we can structure within the recovery programs a very different, more symbiotic, mutualistic public-private partnership that can help us model a different form of capitalism that is more inclusive and more sustainable at its core in that pre-distribution, not just redistribution kind of way. So I'll hand over, Megan, to you. And I had more to say, but I'm beyond my time, so I will be quiet now. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much for those beginning comments. You've given us a ton to work with. Really quickly to remind everyone, if you have questions that you want to submit, and many of you already have, but go ahead and do that in the Q&A section. So if you just look under my picture now, I guess there will be a Q&A button. Just click on that and submit it there. But I'm going to start off by asking Mariana a couple questions and weave in some of yours. Mariana, you highlight that it's probably not right that we need a crisis to come up with a policy strategy, but the reality is actually a crisis is quite a good opportunity for that. And you also mentioned that we did a lot wrong in 2008. And you hinted a little bit at some things that we've learned, but I'm just wondering, of everything you say, how much of this is like pie in the sky thinking versus how much do we actually learn? How much do you see this has actually happened in the response to this crisis?
It is happening, and I'll mention something also that's happening in Europe, because I really believe we need a global agenda. I mean, let's get rid of all this nationalism. Let's learn from each other as much as we can, and stay true to the concept of learning organizations and the knowledge economy, and learn from each other cross-nationally and cross-cities, et cetera. So one interesting thing that's happened in Europe, so it's happening, just to get your point, it's not pie in the sky, it's literally happening today. I was on the phone previously with the Italian Prime Minister's team, is that the European recovery is, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, not conditional on austerity, right? So you'll remember back in the financial crisis, the European recovery was actually conditional on countries like Greece and Italy cutting their deficits, right? Only if they cut their deficit below X percentage would they be bailed out. Now we don't have that talk. The talk is there's a recovery scheme, but we really want this to build a more resilient economy. So every country, all the different member states across Europe have been asked to come up with strategies and plans, originally by October 15th. So, this week, last week, now they've been given one more month around climate. So climate mitigation strategies, digitalization. So the very important role that digitalization within our public administrations plays, and modernizing the public sector as opposed to just saying we need more money, but also digitalization across society. So battling the digital divide, which you'll know in the US and across the world has really been made very clear that there is a massive digital divide, which is a core aspect of inequality, and health, right? So what is your plan for climate, digitalization, and health? They've been asked to come up with their plans, and there's lots of people working towards that across all the countries. And once they do that, the funds will be unlocked. So this is fantastic, right? Now, the problem is that do we actually have structures on the ground that can also then absorb that funding? So if at the same time we have globally, because I have seen this globally, then also outsourcing, say, too much of public sector capacity to consulting companies. This is a huge problem, by the way, in the UK. There was an article about this just last week by a Tory Lord anew, who was saying that the over-reliance on consulting companies has infantilized government, a very interesting word. So if we've outsourced too much of government capacity, if we have corporate governance models that are too financialized and aren't really working very well with the other actors in the economy, if we also don't have certain types of institutions like that patient long-term finance I was talking about in the beginning, then no matter how much money you throw at the system, it doesn't actually land on strong units and structures. So this is, I think the urgent thing, which is that there's no lack of vision or lack of plans to do better. In some countries, there may be a lack of that, but at least when we have it, there's, it's important. But sometimes we lack the structures on the ground. So I do think this is a moment, the COVID moment, to also really look at those structures. And I've already mentioned health systems. That's a key structure, which unfortunately in many countries is weak. But, making sure that we actually invest in those structures when we don't exist is very important. Otherwise, this money just lands on weak areas. And then the other examples I gave of conditionalities, that's happening, right? I mentioned France and Denmark, that's happening. In the US, I know that Elizabeth Warren was very active on that agenda of saying, hey, let's limit how much is being spent on share buybacks in a moment where the US government and the taxpayer is being asked to bail out so many companies. And just so you know the numbers, in the last 10 years, 4 trillion, that's 12 zeros, has been spent on share buybacks. So there's nothing wrong with every now and then doing share buybacks, but this excessive value extraction from the system that's been happening in a specific kind of shareholder maximization form of capitalism needs to be tackled now if we're going to actually, again, build back better. And there are, different places in the world that are trying that. I think what we need to do is scale up all those experiments and lessons.
Great. You talk a lot about kind of rejigging the relationship between the public sector and the private sector, right? In order to encourage innovation to address all these longer term challenges. And in the middle of a crisis, it seems like the carrots for doing that are clear, right? Especially as companies need bailouts, you can just attach lots of strings to them. So the carrots are clear, but I'm wondering, the sticks are clear, so the conditionality. But I'm wondering what the carrots are actually. How do you make a case for firms to actually want to be involved in this rather than just doing it because they've been told to?
So that's where the predistribution agenda comes in. In other words, or I would say the narrative of value comes in that I was talking about in the beginning. If we continue to pretend that value is created in business, and the state is there to simply facilitate, enable, de-risk, and fix market failures, then this whole kind of stick and carrot thing comes in, right? Because you're like, hold on, you can't tell the innovators, the value creators, the risk takers what to do, because if you do, they might stop creating value. So the first thing is to say they are just one part. Business is extremely important to value creation. And there's different types of businesses. There's small, medium, and large, and there's different types of corporate governance structures across all sorts of different sectors. You have lots of different types of firms and different types of governance structures. The question is, if we actually want to transition towards something better, and if the answer is we don't want to transition, then none of what you and I are talking about, Megan, is even relevant. So I'm just assuming a big if. If we want a better form of capitalism, if we want a better economy, a more inclusive, sustainable one, we need to start tilting the playing field towards a certain direction. So rewarding certain types of behavior over others. So those who are actually investing in the long run, yes, they should be helped to do that. We should have a tax system that actually rewards long-term investments and not short-term investments. We should be taxing materials more than labor if we want a green transition, big if. But the other point there that I was just mentioning is that we need to remember that the state is a value creator. So let's take the big pharmaceutical companies. They often say, don't regulate or don't tell us what to do, or we'll stop innovating, or we won't be able to innovate because you take away the incentives. But the truth is they are benefiting, as I've already mentioned, from the massive investments that the state plays. So it's not about taking away, or hurting with a stick. It's about, hey, you want part of this pot? You want to, be part of this amazing partnership that, of course, we should be doing together. You want to access $40 billion a year of public money and health innovation. You want subsidies, guarantees, guaranteed loans, like both Tesla and Solyndra got. Well, it's not going to come completely free. It's going to be because we're going to try to build a stronger economy. So those conditionalities are not conditions. First of all, they're not just about COVID. I've been writing about this now for 20 years, that we need greater conditionality. But they really are about that issue of partnership and ecosystem. You often hear the word ecosystem because it sounds good, right? But you can have parasitic, predator-prey ecosystems. You can have symbiotic and mutualistic ones. So the real question is, how do we, as I was saying in the beginning, bring the notion of purpose and common purpose to the center of partnership between public and private organizations? And that's both about, coming together to even think what the big problems are, but also structuring within the contracts. There's contracts for everything. A patent is a contract. It's a 20-year contract between a public and a private actor. Structuring within those contracts a better, more inclusive, more sustainable growth path. And I gave some examples before, but the call by the World Health Organization now that we actually need a collective patent pool for the vaccine is already one of the ways that one would do that in this kind of tragic moment. But thinking through how to govern the patent system so it's not abused was just as true when we were looking at cancer, diabetes, et cetera.
Great, thanks. Now, you talked about short-termism among corporates, and I think most of us would agree that that's unambiguously bad, except for the guys who get paid because they pursue a short-term horizon. But what are some actual specific policies or regulations that you could put in place in order to shift firms away from this kind of short-termism back towards more interest in stakeholder value?
Sure. I mean, I already mentioned tax, and I don't usually emphasize tax. I usually focus a lot on investment and investment policies, industrial strategies, et cetera. But I'm just very aware of the tax situation also because first of all, a lot of the regressive tax policies that have increased inequality over the years, and for exactly what's happened in inequality, of course, Piketty's book on it was very illuminating. But if you look at that kind of, the exponential increase since the 1970s in inequality in many countries, that was accompanied by certain types of stories we actually told about value and wealth. So in the US, it was actually the National Venture Capital Association that lobbied government to reduce capital gains tax by, I think it was close to 50% in just 4 years at the end of the 1970s, in the name of this is going to create, massive amounts of innovation and value creation, when in truth, what the venture capitalists then did was follow huge amounts, again, of public money in biotech and in the internet area, in nanotech, and more recently in green tech, or even more recently in space tech. And so what happens when you constantly are chipping away at the tax base, you're potentially also chipping away at the public money that can be spent on those very areas that they have relied on. And of course, I know in the US, there's lots of discussion around MMT, and that money actually can be, of course, created in theory out of thin air, which is what we do when we go to war, actually structuring our understanding of how to make sure that there's a fair risk-reward relationship. So if one of the actors, the public actor, is putting in a lot of money into the system, let's make sure that the way even that the venture capitalists, for example, are making money from that system represents the actual risk they took versus the narrative. And those narratives in the US have in fact been used to not only reduce capital gains tax, but also to structure that tax system in a problematic way. I saw in the UK, actually, it was under the Labour Party, it was Gordon Brown, who reduced the time that private equity had to be invested in order to be eligible for capital gains tax reduction from 10 years to 2 years. And that was done in the name of innovation to, become innovative like the US, when actually all that did was increase short-termism. So there's different ways to design, say, capital gains tax reductions to make sure that that is for long-term investments, not short-term investments. We can have globally things like financial transaction taxes to actually, reduce this kind of microsecond amount of profits that are being made just from quickly moving around existing assets instead of creating new structures. We can, again, make sure, there's different ways that you could actually also structure the benefits that companies receive in areas where you do have a lot of public money, like health, energy, and space, et cetera, so that the engagements rely on also time that will be invested together. And of course, share buybacks themselves, different people have written about this. Bill Lazonik, I've also written a couple articles with him, but he's really been pushing this agenda. In some cases, I don't want to say should be banned altogether, but the degree to which they're being used and also how they're being used, which can actually also be accused of insider trading sometime, should be revisited. And that came about from a legal change, policy change from the SEC. So we can undo that. That actually unleashed those changes that were made in the 1980s can be reversed because we used to have more long-term investments. And the fact that today there are these $4 trillion, dollars of share buybacks that have been extracted from the system over the last 10 years, that's a loss to everyone. And when I speak to big businesses who have massively engaged in these share buybacks, why do you do that? Why don't you reinvest in R&D and human capital formation in the long run? Often what you'll hear is there's no opportunities for investment. And that's not true. Of course, there's opportunities for investment. Just look at the opportunities around, again, energy and pharmaceuticals. And these are two of the top share buybackers, by the way, in terms of sectors. So Pfizer, Exxon. And so really making sure that policy itself is focused on creating those opportunities, but also being conditional so that those actors that can benefit from those long-term, also government investments, are playing the game that we want. To formulate a more inclusive and sustainable capitalism. There's all sorts of lessons there. Just one really interesting example, people know about Bell Labs because it was one of the most innovative private sector R&D laboratories that actually came out of an era in the US where in order for AT&T to retain its monopoly status, the government said it had to reinvest its profits back into the real economy, back into innovation and innovation beyond telecoms. So that kind of condition on reinvestment versus value extraction, it seemed just obvious that that's what you would do in order to retain your monopoly status. So it's not about a stick. It is about a different form of purpose-driven and stakeholder engagement.
Great, thank you. And you highlight that, this needs to be a global agenda. But equally, we're living in an era where we have, investment screenings and talk about export controls. And so I just wonder how we square that circle and whether, we are really moving towards a global agenda or whether these other things will probably dominate.
Well,
how do you think about national security in the wake of, or in the mix in all of this?
Right. If we always go back to what the goals are, and I do think they're just global, right? Climate change is not a national goal. It'll never be, tackled just nationally. The question is, how do we not only do the public-private partnership, but the international partnerships, like we have, say, with CERN, like we have on, the International Space Station, but for our societal problems. And it's really interesting to me what has been happening recently, where you have China being one of the most active investors globally in the green transition. Even before the recent announcement just a couple of weeks ago, where they increased it even more, the 5-year plan announced some years ago from China was that they were spending $1.7 trillion in order to really green their entire manufacturing base because of their urgent problem of pollution. Pollution is very bad in China. And they went about it in a cross-sectoral way, kind of in that mission-oriented way I was mentioning before. But you had some countries globally that saw that as an opportunity, not as a threat. So you have today Denmark, which is tiny, literally tiny, as big as some large US cities, which is the #1 provider to China of high-tech green digital services. So in order to render more sustainable your whole value chain, that's not just about doing manufacturing differently, it's also about services that allow you to do that differently. So the whole startup scene, say in Copenhagen, which actually came about from very ambitious targets that they had for their own cities in Denmark, that stimulated all these green startups which today are servicing China's own policy. And having more of that kind of international collaboration as opposed to nationalistic policies, which are about, of course, everyone wants to make their own country great again, make America great again. Of course, that makes sense. Everyone wants their country to be great, but to really understand where your greatness came from in the past and not to dismantle that along the way, that's the challenge. And well, I think I said enough there, but I think ironically, and I'll say this in a provocative way, I think ironically, China has looked very closely at what worked in the US, and they are learning from that. They're adapting to it. They are themselves investing in a green transition with the boldness that the United States, invested in the internet economy, in our current digitalized economy. And this is happening at the same time, and this is the provocation, that the US is unlearning that. It wasn't just public money that got us Silicon Valley. It was ambitious organizations. It was the DARPAs. It was the, today I would argue, ARPA-E type organization. But if at the same time there's chipping away at not only the budgets, but the ambition of actually having mission-oriented public sector institutions, that itself is a process of unlearning what got us to the moon. And we need to be as bold as we were getting to the moon today to actually fight the biggest problems we have, which are inequality, climate, and the current health pandemic, which is about strengthening our welfare state.
No, that's your provocation actually was embedded in one of the questions that came in, which was kind of, are you sort of putting forward the idea of state capitalism and in a way, and if so, how different is that from what China's doing, which you sort of just answered? And I want to add a question to that.
Okay, sorry, go on.
Just in asking about industrial policy, because it's related to what you were just saying. Normally we think of that as kind of a protectionist thing, a protectionist pursuit, but it seems like you're suggesting it doesn't actually have to be protectionist. You don't need to determine by sector. It could just be by goal, and it could be a global goal, actually. Is that right? Is that how you're suggesting that we have industrial policy? Because for the US, for example, for the first time in decades, there's actually bipartisan support for industrial policy. So I think it will be here to stay. I'm curious to hear what you think, a bit more on how you think it should look.
Sure. So two things. One, just to clarify on China. I called the US the entrepreneurial state. I would say China's the adaptive state because they look a lot at what's happening and try to learn from it. But China currently, I don't advocate state capitalism. I don't even know what that means, to be honest, because I think it means very different things to different people. What worked in the US was very strong setting of government objectives, but a lot of bottom-up experimentation in terms of how you got there. I don't believe in top-down processes. If the state, like it did in the Soviet Union, spends a lot on R&D, but then doesn't set up a dynamic system of innovation across all those different decentralized actors that I mentioned before, basic research, applied research, mechanisms for the two to talk to each other, patient long-term finance, well-designed procurement policy, all these things to then stimulate innovation within the private sector. So crowding in private sector investment, then it doesn't work. If it's top-down, it doesn't work. But you still need that kind of combination. And that's what I actually mean by mission-oriented policies, strong government objectives. That's what government's for. I mean, government has to have an objective, right, of actually solving big problems that mean something to citizens, less polluted streets, stronger health systems, lower digital divide. But to do that in such a way that's lined up with innovation policy and industrial strategy, an industrial strategy that is not, and this comes to your second question, just a list of sectors, but is a cross-sectoral approach towards achieving those problems. That's I actually have these boards here because I use them all the time. I don't know if you can see it, right? So climate change, carbon neutral cities, real estate, energy, mobility, food, environment, and then all these bottom-up projects, which are from citizen carbon ID cards, clean urban electric mobility, buildings with carbon absorbing components. All these projects are invested in and innovated in from the private sector. And they are stimulated to do that through well-designed procurement, through well-designed grants and loans, or prize schemes. I think we've underinvested and under thought of prize schemes, how useful they can be to really reward or create incentives to innovate towards public problems. That's not what China does, right? So China currently is spending a lot of money around green innovation. They have large actors like the Chinese Development Bank, which also provided Huawei in its early stages in telecoms with a very large guaranteed loan. I think one of their challenges in China is if they learn the real lessons of the US model, which is that decentralized network of different types of public actors distributed across the whole innovation chain, which co-create alongside the private sector, right? This is capitalism, it's not socialism, alongside the private sector, value and markets. But again, with those, strong kind of public goal setting. And what we have in many countries, including the US right now, is not enough of the public goal setting, but also how we then structure the benefits sometimes ends up with this dysfunctional system where we socialize risks, but then privatize rewards. And the cylinder example, which is often taken out of the box when people say, oh God, don't talk about picking winners and government making investments because government's a bad investor. They use Solyndra or the Concorde plane as an example. And what's interesting is the Solyndra investment, which was 500 million in a guaranteed loan by the DOE, was more or less the same amount that Tesla got. So the problem was not that Solyndra got the money, it's that it wasn't structured as a proper portfolio. Because had it been structured as a proper portfolio, they would have recognized that, you have different investments. Some went to Tesla, some went to Solyndra's. Talk to any venture capitalist. For every success like Tesla, you will have 6 or 7 failures. But a venture capitalist would never just assume that, it's okay to fail again. You want to make sure that your successes, the few you have, are well worth the risk. And so Obama actually said to Elon Musk, if you don't pay back the loan, we want 3 million shares in your company. What he should have said, if you do pay back the loan, which of course they did because they're a healthy company, 2013 paid it back. If they had gotten 3 million shares in Tesla, the price per share went from 9 to 90. That would have more than paid back the Solyndra loss and the next round of investment. And I'm not the one saying take shares. They actually said, it's completely ununderstandable to me why they thought this would work. The Obama administration told Tesla, we will get 3 million shares if you don't pay back the loan. So that idea of kind of private good, public bad has even been structured into how we make these kind of weird deals. And this isn't about nationalization. It's not about socialism, but it is about saying if you are going to be an investor of first resort, think through the creative structures that might allow you also to benefit, beyond just the generic spillovers that we all assume will happen to society. Because the generic spillovers, which are very important, happen with, say, basic R&D. You don't want to be getting a share, say, of anything from R&D, but these downstream investments, which companies have often gotten from the US government, I think there is an open window there right now to restructure them. So we're socializing both risks and rewards.
Great. Thank you so much, Mariana. We're running out of time. And I have to say I'm really impressed by your poster board that you happen to have there.
Oh yeah, I've got more. Look, I've got a Clean Oceans one too. Oh, wow. So Clean Oceans, plastic-free ocean, all these sectors. This is that mission-oriented approach in the European Commission that I managed to get through, and they actually voted on it in the Parliament. And now it's an instrument that the EC is using in order to guide the kind of challenge-based funds, because otherwise we can talk about sustainable growth all we want, but if there isn't a clear investment plan, we don't get there.
Yeah. Well, and in many ways, this conversation that we're having is a timeless one. It's one we could be having at any point in history, but it does also feel like now is a really unique opportunity to really shake things up and try to change the conversation. So thanks so much for joining us at this moment in history when maybe we can help change the conversation and the narrative a bit, Mariana.
No, thank you. And let's stay positive.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll pass it back over to Julia to close up.
Yeah, thank you. Just from our end, from the Atlanta Council, from the Juneau Economic Center, thanks to you both, to Mariana, to Megan, for a fascinating conversation today. I know we could have gone on for a long time. When it comes down to it, and you may be forgiven for your distraction, I think this is really what the U.S. election is about. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. Just a quick word of thanks also to some of our partners who are here today, C. Boyd & Gray, Michael Margolis, and Penny Nass. Your support is invaluable. Again, thanks to you both. I hope everyone enjoyed this conversation, and let's keep going. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.